There is a number on your last blood panel that your doctor glanced at for 2 seconds and moved on. Not your cholesterol, not your glucose, not your blood pressure, your triglycerides. And what nobody told you is this. That number, sitting quietly in the middle of your lab report, may be the most accurate early warning signal your engine has produced in years. A signal pointing not just to your heart, but to your arteries, your brain, your hormonal system, and the decade of health that is still ahead of you. Most people over 40 are told to watch it. No explanation, no urgency, just a glance and a pivot. That pivot may have already cost something. This is not about eating less fat. It is not about a 30-day fix or a supplement that promises clean arteries by Tuesday. This is about your engine, about the fuel system running inside a body that has crossed into a new operational phase.
About why a machine that ran cleanly for decades is now building pressure in places you cannot feel yet. If you have ever looked at your labs and felt dismissed or quietly unsettled by a number nobody explained properly, stay with me. This conversation is long overdue. Let us start at the beginning. Not the version your doctor has 3 minutes to give you. The version that actually explains what is happening inside your body. Triglycerides are a form of fat. But here is the part most people never hear. They are not just the fat you eat. They are also the fat your body manufactures. And that distinction changes everything about how you read your labs. Here is the mechanism. Every time you eat, your body breaks food down into its basic components. Glucose enters your bloodstream. Your cells absorb what they need immediately for fuel. Whatever is left over does not simply disappear. Your liver receives it, converts it, and packages that surplus into triglycerides. Those triglycerides are then loaded into particles called VLDL and released into your bloodstream. Think of VLDL as fuel delivery trucks. Their job is to move packaged energy from the liver to your tissues, muscle, fat cells, organs that need fuel throughout the day. In a well-calibrated engine, this system runs cleanly. The trucks load, deliver, and clear the lines quickly. Efficient, continuous, almost invisible. After 40, the timing shifts. The trucks take longer to unload. They linger in circulation. And if your liver keeps producing more, because you keep giving it more fuel than your cells can absorb, the lines become congested. Triglycerides accumulate, and the longer they remain in circulation, the more damage they are capable of doing. Now here is where the standard advice breaks down. Most people hear high triglycerides and immediately cut fat. Low-fat yogurt, low-fat salad dressing, low-fat everything. And their numbers stay elevated. Sometimes they rise. Why? Because the primary driver of elevated fasting triglycerides is not dietary fat, it is excess carbohydrate, specifically refined carbohydrates and added sugars. When your liver receives more glucose than your cells can use, its job is clear: convert and store. Some of that conversion gets stored directly in the liver itself, which is how fatty liver disease quietly begins. The rest enters your bloodstream as triglycerides. Research published in major metabolic journals has confirmed consistently that in most adults over 40, fasting triglycerides correlate far more strongly with carbohydrate intake and insulin resistance than with fat consumption. The food most people were told was safe: bread, fruit juice, low-fat snacks, cereals with heart-healthy labels. These are often the primary fuels overloading the system. There is a second layer here that almost never comes up in a routine appointment. Triglycerides in circulation do not simply float harmlessly until your body needs them. When they remain elevated over time, they begin to interact with your LDL cholesterol particles through a biochemical exchange driven by an enzyme called CETP. Triglycerides transfer into LDL particles. Cholesterol transfers out. The result is a smaller, denser LDL particle. And small, dense LDL is a fundamentally different threat than the larger, more buoyant particles most people picture when they hear the word cholesterol. Large LDL particles are relatively harmless. They are too bulky to penetrate arterial walls easily. Small, dense LDL particles are not. They slip into arterial walls more readily. They stay longer. They oxidize faster. An oxidized LDL inside an arterial wall is one of the primary triggers for the inflammatory cascade that leads to plaque. This means your standard cholesterol reading can look acceptable while structural damage is already underway inside your arteries. The number on the panel says fine. The particles inside the wall are saying something different. Your engine is not malfunctioning. It is doing exactly what a biological system does, converting excess fuel into storage, managing what it receives. The problem is that after 40, the clearance slows, the storage fills, and the surplus stays in circulation far longer than it should. In the next part, I want to take you inside the arterial wall, because what happens there over years of elevated triglycerides is more specific and more urgent than the general picture most people carry. Most people picture clogged arteries like a pipe slowly filling with grease. The image is not entirely wrong, but it is incomplete. And the gap between that image and what is actually happening is precisely where the danger lives undetected. Your arteries are not passive pipes. They are living structures, dynamic, responsive, and exquisitely sensitive to what flows through them. Their inner surface is lined by a single layer of cells called the endothelium. This lining is not decorative. It regulates blood flow. It controls inflammation. It actively repels the kind of deposits that lead to cardiovascular events. When it works correctly, blood moves through clean and unobstructed. When it is chronically exposed to elevated triglycerides, it begins to change, gradually, silently, without symptoms. The process is called endothelial dysfunction. The lining loses its smooth, repellent quality. It becomes reactive, inflamed, microscopically rough in ways that standard imaging cannot easily detect in its early stages. And that roughness begins to catch things. Immune cells migrate to the site. Small LDL particles, the dense ones we discussed, penetrate the wall and become trapped. They oxidize. Immune cells attempt to consume the oxidized LDL and become what pathologists call foam cells. Foam cells accumulate. And over years, that accumulation becomes what cardiologists call an atherosclerotic plaque. This process does not announce itself. There is no pain at 44, no obvious signal at 47. It builds in the background of a life that feels normal until the plaque ruptures, or the artery narrows enough to restrict flow significantly. Then the event arrives, and people describe it as sudden. It was not sudden. It was years in the making. Triglycerides are directly implicated in accelerating that process, through the small, dense LDL mechanism, through the inflammation they promote, and through a second mechanism that is almost never discussed in a routine appointment. Your body produces an enzyme called lipoprotein lipase. It sits on the walls of your capillaries, particularly in muscle tissue. Its function is to intercept triglyceride-carrying particles in circulation and pull their contents into tissue for fuel or storage. When lipoprotein lipase works well, the fuel trucks unload efficiently. Lines clear quickly. Arterial exposure is brief. After 40, lipoprotein lipase activity declines. It declines faster in people who carry more abdominal fat, faster in people with lower muscle mass, faster in those whose insulin signaling has begun to slip. The trucks cannot unload. They stay in circulation. Triglycerides remain elevated longer. Arterial exposure extends, and the endothelial damage compounds with every cycle. Now, here is a practical tool that most people have never been given: your triglyceride to HDL ratio. Take your fasting triglycerides, divide by your HDL.
That single calculation is one of the most accessible and underused cardiovascular risk predictors available on a standard blood panel. Research published in major cardiology journals has shown consistently that this ratio is strongly associated with small, dense LDL particle pattern, the atherogenic pattern most directly linked to arterial plaque progression. Below 2 is favorable. Between 2 and 3 is a yellow flag. Above 3 demands serious attention and a deeper diagnostic conversation. Most people have never calculated this number. It requires no additional test. It is already on your panel, and it tells you significantly more about your real cardiovascular risk than total cholesterol alone. Write it down after this video. That number is part of your engine's diagnostics panel, and right now, most people are reading only half the gauges. But the arterial story does not stop at your chest. In the next part, I want to take you somewhere that most triglyceride conversations never reach. Your brain. Because what is happening in your fuel lines is reaching your control center. And it is explaining symptoms that millions of people over 40 have quietly accepted as normal aging. Your brain consumes roughly 20% of your body's total energy. For an organ that weighs about 3 pounds, that is a remarkable demand. To meet that demand continuously, your brain depends on something most people never think about when they look at a lipid panel. It depends on clean, consistent blood flow through an extraordinarily dense network of vessels, many of them thinner than a human hair. Vessels so fine that even minor changes in the lining, the kind of changes chronic triglyceride elevation produces, can alter the brain's fuel delivery in ways you feel before any scan would show it. This is where the triglyceride story stops being a heart story and becomes something more personal. Most conversations about triglycerides stop at the cardiovascular system. And that framing, while critical, misses what is now being confirmed by a growing body of neurological and metabolic research. Chronically elevated triglycerides create a metabolic environment that reaches your control center, not always by crossing the blood-brain barrier directly, though emerging evidence suggests some triglyceride-derived compounds do exactly that, but through the systemic inflammation they drive, through the impaired microvascular circulation they produce, through the insulin resistance they both reflect and actively worsen. That environment does not stay contained in your chest. It reaches the brain, consistently, over time. Long-term studies following middle-aged adults over 10 to 15 years have found that chronically elevated triglycerides in the 40s are associated with measurable declines in processing speed, working memory, and executive function by the late 50s and early 60s, not as an inevitable function of age. As a function of what the metabolic environment did to the brain's vascular supply across those years. The regions most vulnerable to this kind of vascular compromise are the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus. The prefrontal cortex handles sustained attention, decision-making, and emotional regulation. The hippocampus is central to memory formation and retrieval. Now think about what people over 40 most commonly describe as just getting older. The half-second delay before a word arrives. The afternoon where focus dissolves without a clear reason. The sense that the mental dashboard is running at reduced brightness. Decisions that once felt sharp, now feeling effortful. These are not inevitabilities. For many people, they are downstream signals of a fuel system that has been running compromised for years. A control center receiving inconsistent delivery through vessels that have lost some of their precision. Here is the deeper layer, the one that makes this genuinely urgent. Insulin resistance and elevated triglycerides almost always travel together. They are expressions of the same underlying metabolic dysfunction. And insulin resistance in the brain is now one of the most actively studied mechanisms in Alzheimer's disease research. The connection is specific. The brain begins to lose its ability to use glucose efficiently. Energy metabolism in neurons deteriorates. The pathological proteins associated with Alzheimer's accumulate more readily in an environment of chronic inflammation and impaired insulin signaling,
And the conditions that accelerate that deterioration are the same conditions that elevate your fasting triglycerides. This is not a distant theoretical risk. It is a biological sequence that begins decades before any diagnosis. And here is what the research also shows. In the early and intermediate stages of this dysfunction, the brain retains meaningful adaptive capacity.
Adults who address the underlying metabolic drivers, who bring fasting triglycerides down through targeted, system-level intervention, show measurable improvements in cognitive markers, documented improvements, in real people who took the system seriously. The fog is not permanent, but you have to understand its actual source. The source is not your age. It is a fuel system running under chronic overload. And underneath that fuel system is a hormonal layer that most lipid conversations never reach. In the next part, I want to show you exactly how the hormonal software shift after 40 changes the way your liver operates, the way fat distributes, and the way triglycerides are produced. Because this is the link that changes the entire maintenance equation. Let me tell you something that almost never comes up in a routine lipid conversation. Your triglycerides are not just a nutrition problem. They are a hormonal problem. And after 40, the hormonal software running your metabolism shifts in ways that directly alter how your body handles fat in the bloodstream. Understanding this is not a detail. It is the foundation of everything that follows. Start with insulin. Insulin is the primary hormonal signal driving triglyceride production in the liver. Every time blood sugar rises, insulin rises with it. Among insulin's many functions is signaling the liver to package excess glucose into triglycerides and release them into circulation. In a well-calibrated engine, insulin spikes are short and purposeful. They rise, accomplish their task, and return to baseline quickly. The system responds, the fuel moves, the lines stay clear. After 40, insulin sensitivity declines in most people. The cells do not respond to insulin's signal as readily. The pancreas compensates by producing more insulin. Insulin stays elevated longer. And as long as insulin remains elevated, the liver continues producing triglycerides. Not because you ate more, because the signaling system changed. This state is called insulin resistance, and it is one of the most common, most underdiagnosed conditions in adults over 40. It can be present for years before fasting glucose rises above the normal range. Years where damage is accumulating, and every standard panel comes back with a reassuring green checkmark. A fasting insulin test changes that picture immediately. It is inexpensive, it is rarely ordered in routine care, and it is one of the most informative metabolic data points available to you right now. If your fasting insulin is above 10 microunits per milliliter, your engine is operating under significant metabolic stress, regardless of what your cholesterol panel shows, regardless of what your glucose reads. Now, let me talk specifically about women, because the hormonal picture here is precise and almost never explained clearly. During perimenopause and into menopause, estrogen declines. And estrogen is not simply a reproductive hormone. It plays a direct regulatory role in how the liver handles fat metabolism. Estrogen actively suppresses excessive triglyceride production in the liver. It supports insulin sensitivity at the cellular level. It helps maintain HDL concentrations. It is part of the firmware keeping your fuel system in balance. When estrogen declines, that regulatory signal weakens. The liver operates with less suppression of triglyceride output. Insulin sensitivity decreases. Fat distribution shifts toward the abdomen. And abdominal fat is not passive storage. It is metabolically active tissue that promotes inflammation, worsens insulin resistance, and further disrupts the hormonal environment. This is why so many women watch their labs shift in their late 40s and early 50s without any meaningful change in diet or lifestyle. They did not change. The software updated, and the fuel system responded to the new instructions. Most women are never told this. They are told to eat less, move more, and accept the new numbers as aging.
That framing is not just incomplete, it is costly. Because when you treat a software problem with a hardware solution, the results are limited and temporary. For men, the picture is different, but equally important and equally underexplored. Testosterone plays a direct role in maintaining insulin sensitivity and preserving muscle mass. Muscle is your primary tissue for glucose disposal after a meal. When muscle is metabolically active and insulin sensitive, glucose moves into it efficiently. Less glucose reaches the liver. Less is converted into triglycerides. As testosterone declines with age, muscle mass decreases. Insulin sensitivity drops. More excess glucose reaches the liver. Triglyceride production increases. Abdominal fat accumulates. And abdominal fat, in men, actively converts testosterone into estrogen through a process called aromatization, which further suppresses testosterone, which accelerates muscle loss, which worsens insulin resistance, which raises triglycerides further. It is a loop, and it tightens over time if it is not addressed at the system level. Research in men over 45 has consistently shown a meaningful inverse relationship between testosterone levels and fasting triglycerides. The lower the testosterone, the higher the triglycerides tend to run. The association is not perfect, but it is strong enough that any comprehensive metabolic evaluation in an aging man should include both markers on the same panel. Looking at triglycerides without looking at testosterone and fasting insulin is like reading one gauge on a dashboard that has 8. You are getting a fragment of the picture, and fragments lead to partial solutions that do not hold. The hormonal software is not failing. It is running a different version of the program, one that your fuel system is adapting to in real time. The question is whether you are giving your system the inputs that version of the program actually requires. In the next part, I want to bring all of this together: the fuel overload, the arterial damage, the brain connection, the hormonal layer, and I want to show you something that the individual pieces cannot show you on their own: what this system looks like when you see it whole. I want you to see something that most people never see clearly. Everything we have discussed in this video is not 5 separate problems. It is one system. And the reason most interventions for elevated triglycerides produce disappointing results in people over 40 is not that the interventions are wrong. It is that they target one variable in a multivariable system, and the system compensates around them. Cut carbohydrates. Triglycerides drop initially, then plateau. Start exercising. Some improvement. It stalls. Take a supplement. Marginal movement. Inconsistent over time. None of these fail because the information is bad. They fail because after 40, the components of this system are no longer operating independently. They are coupled. They reinforce each other. A disruption in one part cascades into the others, and a single variable fix cannot address a multivariable cascade. Here is the full loop. Excess refined carbohydrate raises blood sugar. Insulin rises. If insulin sensitivity is already impaired, insulin stays elevated longer than it should. The liver receives the signal to produce more triglycerides. Those triglycerides remodel LDL particles into the smaller, denser form. Endothelial inflammation progresses, blood flow to the brain becomes less consistent, cognitive sharpness diminishes, mood regulation weakens, and sleep quality degrades. Now here is where the cascade compounds in a way most people have never considered. Poor sleep raises cortisol. Elevated cortisol raises blood sugar overnight through a process called hepatic glucose output. The liver releases stored glucose into the bloodstream, even during fasting hours. That glucose raises insulin. Elevated insulin raises liver triglyceride output, and the cycle runs again, through the very hours that were supposed to be the engine's maintenance window. This is why 2 people can follow the same dietary protocol and get dramatically different triglyceride results. One sleeps well, one does not. The one who does not is running the cortisol loop every night, offsetting whatever the diet achieved during the day. Sleep is not a lifestyle preference. It is a direct upstream variable in your triglyceride equation.
Meanwhile, the hormonal software is running a version that no longer provides the regulatory suppression that once kept this cascade contained. Estrogen is lower, testosterone may be declining. The signals that held the liver's triglyceride output in check for decades are operating at reduced amplitude. And muscle mass, the hardware most people overlook entirely in this conversation, has been quietly declining since the mid-30s. Each pound of muscle lost represents a meaningful reduction in your body's capacity to pull glucose out of the bloodstream efficiently. Less glucose disposal means more glucose reaching the liver. More reaching the liver means more triglycerides in circulation. Here is what that means practically. You can eat a clean diet and still have elevated triglycerides if your muscle mass is insufficient, your sleep is poor, and your hormonal software has shifted without being addressed. The fuel input improved, but the system it feeds into is still compromised. This is why the maintenance protocol for elevated triglycerides after 40 must address the full engine. First, reduce the fuel overload at the source. Reduce refined carbohydrates and added sugars, not because all carbohydrates are harmful. Because in a metabolically stressed engine, refined carbohydrate is the primary driver of liver triglyceride output. Whole food carbohydrates, consumed alongside adequate protein and fat, behave very differently in the same system. Second, rebuild the hardware. Resistance training 2 to 3 times per week measurably improves insulin sensitivity and glucose disposal capacity within weeks. This is not aesthetic maintenance. This is primary metabolic infrastructure. Muscle is where glucose goes to disappear from your bloodstream. You cannot outsource that function. Third, protect the overnight repair cycle. 7 to 9 hours of quality sleep is not a recovery tool. It is a direct metabolic intervention. Everything else you do is less effective when the cortisol loop is running unchecked every night. Fourth, run a complete diagnostic. Fasting triglycerides, fasting insulin, HDL, triglyceride to HDL ratio. For women over 45, a hormone panel.
For men over 45, testosterone alongside fasting insulin. Read the gauges together. That is when the dashboard starts telling the truth. Fifth, address the hormonal software deliberately. If your assessment reveals significant hormonal shifts, that conversation belongs in a clinical setting with a physician who understands metabolic medicine, not a generic protocol, a system-aware evaluation. Your engine did not fail you. It adapted to the inputs it received, the software it was running, and the maintenance it was given. A biological system responds to its environment. That is not failure. That is function, which means it can adapt again in the right direction, with the right inputs, the right sequence, and the right information. I want to say something directly to you before we close this out. Most people who watch a video this long on a topic this specific are not browsing. They are looking for something. A real explanation for what their body is doing. A conversation that does not treat them like they cannot handle the full picture. A place where the science is integrated, not simplified into uselessness. If that is what brought you here, you are in the right place. And there is something else you should know. The people who watch this channel are not here because they have given up. They are here because they have decided that understanding their own system is not optional anymore. That the standard conversation, the 3-minute appointment, the vague recommendation to watch it is not enough. They want to read the full dashboard, not just the one light that is blinking. That is the human engine. Not a diet channel, not a fitness motivation space, a place where adults over 40 come to understand how the system actually operates at this stage of life, how the fuel lines behave, how the hormonal firmware shifts, how the control center responds to what the rest of the engine is doing, and what maintenance level thinking looks like when the engine is no longer running the same program it ran at 32. If this is the kind of clarity you are looking for, subscribe and stay close. Because the next video and the one after that are built on the same foundation, system level, evidence integrated, designed for adults who are ready to take their engines seriously. Beyond the videos, there is more here. Frameworks built inside the engine model, protocols grounded in the same science you just spent the last hour with. When you are ready to go further than a single video, that infrastructure is available to you. But right now, let us finish what we started. Because understanding the problem, the full cascade, the fuel overload, the arterial damage, the brain exposure, the hormonal software shift, is only the first part of what matters. The second part is understanding what the next 10 years look like when the engine is actually maintained correctly.
When the fuel lines are running clear, when the hardware is rebuilt, when the software is supported rather than ignored, when the overnight repair cycle is protected instead of sacrificed to the demands of a busy life. That picture is different from what most people expect, and it is available. Not to the genetically fortunate, to the people who learn to read their own system accurately, early enough to act on what it is telling them. Let us bring this home. Let me leave you with something. At some point in recent years, you may have sat across from a doctor who glanced at a number on a page and moved on. No context, no roadmap, just a quiet, keep an eye on that, and a pivot to the next item. You walked out with the number still floating somewhere in the back of your mind, unresolved, slightly heavier than it should have been. Maybe you told yourself you would deal with it later.
Maybe you accepted the fog, the resistance, the stubborn weight, the flat energy as the price of getting older. It was not the price of getting older. It was your engine telling you, in the only language it has, that the maintenance protocol needed to change. Today, you have a different vocabulary for that signal. You know that triglycerides are not a fat problem. They are a fuel management problem, a system problem, one that involves the liver and insulin, the arterial wall and its lining, the brain and its vascular supply, the hormonal software and the hardware that executes its instructions. You know that the triglyceride to HDL ratio is sitting on your lab panel right now, already calculated, waiting to be read. You know that small, dense LDL particles can be accumulating inside arterial walls while your standard panel reports everything is acceptable. You know that the fog is not age, it is metabolic, and it responds to the right input. You know that the overnight repair cycle is not optional, that muscle is infrastructure, not aesthetics, that hormonal shifts do not need to be accepted silently. They need to be understood and addressed as what they are, a firmware update that the system requires a new response to. You were not given a broken engine. You were given an engine that entered a new operational phase, a phase that the standard maintenance manual does not cover, one that requires reading more gauges, understanding more systems, and applying a different kind of care. Precise care, patient care, the kind that does not promise quick results because it is not built on quick results. It is built on understanding, and understanding, once it arrives, does not leave. Now, do something with what you learned here. Pull your last blood panel, find your fasting triglycerides, find your HDL, divide one by the other. Write that number down, not as a verdict, as a baseline. The starting point of a more accurate conversation with your own system. Share this video with 5 people over 40 who are still getting the 3-minute appointment and walking away with more questions than answers. They need this conversation. Subscribe to The Human Engine if you are not already here. Leave a comment. Tell me your ratio. Tell me what question this video left open for you. Tell me what you want to understand next. Cortisol and abdominal fat, heart function under metabolic stress, sleep architecture after 40 and what it does to your baseline, the brain's own fuel system and what the data actually shows about protecting it. There is an entire engine to maintain, and we are just getting started. Until next time,
keep optimizing.